it going? I was figuring we could see if anyone has specific experiences they want to share and get feedback on. And then if not, we can also talk a little bit about some negotiation best practices and that kind of thing. But I welcome your feedback as well. You've obviously done negotiating, DW. What's any come to mind that were particularly insightful for you?
Yeah, I think one I wanted to talk about was, I feel like for a lot of the reps, they just get stuck in a pricing back and forth. And I feel like in this day and age where the consumers have become even more knowledgeable through review sites and their own research and those kind of activities, that it's very difficult for sellers to present new value and also have. In the past, we talked about information supremacy. For instance, when you bought, a sofa, when you go to the dealership there, the people have more information than you all the time on those products. Whereas now we generally know more than the sellers. So in these environments, getting past price has become very difficult. And that's where technology has started to replace people, because technology can facilitate back and forth quoting, can't it? So how do we elevate the conversation from price to value? Have you ever felt those kind of experiences on your end?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a personal note, yes. And I think it speaks to something that's probably relevant to a lot of the people on this call, which is it's really easy to get fixated on a specific issue, but oftentimes the best deals happen when we take it as sort of a package, a multi-issue negotiation. I mean, I think when we have, for example, a negotiation, whether it's a sales situation or something, in our non-work lives, it's really hard just on a cognitive level to hold in our minds all of those different like levers and components that we could tweak. And so I think that's where the prep work becomes really important, which is knowing in advance, like, okay, if I'm going to go into a conversation with someone, what are like 4 or 5 different combinations of all of these different issues that I would be comfortable with? And knowing that like you can talk about issues simultaneously rather than this temptation, like first let's settle on price, then let's go into like customer support, then let's go into this, because it can become really narrowing rather than sort of expanding the pie, so to speak. I don't know, does anybody who's listening have experience with multi-issue negotiations? I don't know if anyone wants to chime in. I'm going to keep offering because I hope.
Yeah. That's a good point, though. When you try to satisfy one at a time, that generally can stall progress. And also you want to combine the different variables sometimes for a bit of give and take. So that's a really good point of advice. Do you feel like there's some particular areas that become sources of frustrations?
Yeah, I think obviously things like price are really easy for us to quantify. And so that becomes one where we get stuck because we can see the numbers and we forget about the value of more qualitative things, which is why I think on the main call, I sort of said before you go into a negotiation, like think about what the quantitative value is for those things. Like create a point system for yourself. It doesn't mean you have to, I don't recommend you share it with your counterpart, but I think it's a helpful exercise in knowing what things are worth to you. What's the promise of, a connection with 5 other potential clients? What is that worth to you? What is their participation in a case study worth to you? And so I think having an understanding of those helps prevent us from getting stuck. I think the other thing sometimes that drives people to get stuck on issues is when they feel like it's about saving face. I think that can become something where people need to feel like they have choice and that they are getting a good deal. And we talk a lot about sort of the numeric values of deals. And the reality is that sometimes we assess our performance by how we feel after the negotiation. And from an academic perspective, what I find really fascinating is there's research to show that how we feel about a deal is actually not correlated to our performance in a deal. And I think being able to separate that for ourselves is really important, but still recognizing that if we feel like we're getting stuck on an issue or our counterpart isn't budging, it might be because they feel like they aren't getting any sort of wins, that they're holding this very like distributive mindset. And it's on you as their counterpart to give them an opportunity to save face, to tell them, you know, look, I want to solve this problem. Like, how can we work together, and try to reframe and shift so you guys can move off of the issue. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities to get stuck, but also opportunities to pivot.
Yeah.
Has anyone all gotten stuck on an issue that made a negotiation stall? Did you manage to get through it? Did it tank? Don't be shy.
There's probably a lot out there, but it's tough to put the hand up. I know I find it tough as well, even on the panel. But yeah, in my team, we often get stuck in deals against competitors. That's probably the main area. And when it comes to competitive differentiation, I always have a little equation, which is people buy when PV is greater than P. So perceived value is greater than price. So we work so much on trying to create more perceived value in what we do. And against competitors, it can be helpful to work with the buyer and produce like a competitive matrix of the positives and negatives. Some people do SWOTs or other techniques, and you can book that as a session where you work through on, we like to use a Google Sheet, but you could pick another tool. And essentially what you're doing is helping that buyer build up those strengths and weaknesses with them and for them, because they're going to do that anyway themselves when they go away and present that document internally. And then what's interesting is we have technology that we can apply which tracks who reads it, how long, and what their name and email is. So, you know, that's interesting intelligence for us because we kind of know if there's traction in that account by how that content is consumed.
Oh, we have a visitor. Let's add them in. Hi, welcome.
Yes, hi guys, how are you?
Good.
Yes, yes, yes. So first of all, thank you very much again. You are sharing some great content here regarding sales and negotiation. Thank you very much again. I want to ask you both of you, if you have to choose, or if you need to choose only one outreach method, maybe call or call email, or any other stuff that you can think of, what would you choose? The best option for you that you can rely on.
I'd say LinkedIn connection requests. They penetrate super well because you get a notification that pushes to the phone, and secondly, you can embed something like a video or a link that's clickable. Not a lot of people know that you can do that as part of the connection request. So in this day and age, we get almost half of those replied to in our team at the moment. So it's by far the best performing method.
I think too, to answer that question, I mean, I'd love to give you this like blanket answer. What I would say though is it's about knowing your audience and what method they are most comfortable with. So for example, for me, if you call me on my cell phone, I'm not going to answer that, and I think that's about understanding the demographics, understanding the industry that you're reaching out to. For me, reaching out to me via email is going to be the most effective way, or via LinkedIn, right? And so as much as I would love to say this is the universal best way to reach out, it goes back to what we've been saying all throughout, which is doing your research. But I definitely feel like there is a shift against sort of the cold call, just because I think in our day and age, people are less and less relying on phone calls. But I've been out of industry for a while, so take it with a grain of salt.
Okay, but I really want to sell my products, right? So we have been talking about building repo, or let's say deposits first, then after try for withdrawals, right? This kind of concept coming up on LinkedIn, right? I understand that it's really important. It's critically important for us to build and develop that kind of relationship with different people and prospects as well. This will take some time, right? So I have my task on my plate. I am a guy. I'm involved in hardcore outreach programs or hardcore outreach activities for my business, and I want to generate some sales. I cannot keep giving content or knowledge or that kind of stuff. No, I want to pitch right. At the same time, I want to make sure that I'm radically relevant to the people's problems and what they're looking for, obviously. And I want to make sure that I'm able to help them, solve their problems. I'm not talking about content sharing. I'm not talking about, building my network. I can do that on LinkedIn or Facebook, other stuff, right? But I want to sell. So and I want to rely on a couple of more techniques from both of you. Let me know. It's email outbound, or let's say call calling, or even I'm connecting with you, Andrea, and Delius, LinkedIn after 1 hour, 2 days. So after half an hour, I'll pitch for sure because I want to sell my products to you. I cannot keep, I have 100 people. For 5 to 10 people, I can keep giving my content or let's say knowledge, right? Hey, listen this. Hey, take this. Hey, this will help you X Y Z X Y Z. But how about my meat? I want to sell my products. I want to go, and seek my customers, outreach, proper outreach. So, do you think, this will help me in the future? This kind of concept, this kind of approach, if I want to sell something, networking, yes, no disrespect to networking or relationship building with the customers for sure. But when you talk about hardcore sales, right? What would you advise me on that? Outreach or hardcore sales? How I'm supposed to approach, or I'm supposed to go ahead with that.
What product are you selling?
Yeah, so I'm selling SaaS. Yes, I'm selling SaaS, software as a service, and the core product is that we are networking platform, right? So we are also a virtual event technology service and product provider, right? It has a lot of things there, right? For example, engagement, networking, session hosting, and the panel discussions, all the stuff, right? So I joined this session, and it's really good for me that I'm talking to you. But from sales perspective, whether I am insurance, whether I am selling any IT services, or I'm working with Microsoft, I'm working with Dell Corporation or Google, or I'm working with my small company, right? But I want to sell the product. So networking is aside. I'm talking about hardcore sales process here. So I'm calling you right now, and I'm giving my cold speech. So I want to improve myself in outbound sales process, hardcore selling, networking. I can do content. I can provide. That's fine. It's not a problem for me. But I want to sell this product to you, and I know you might like my product, and you might give me a time for meeting, right? So how am I going to do that, or what is your take on what on this concept? Hey, listen, Ali, your concept is really bad. What would you say? Or it's pathetic, or you need to change your strategy, or you need to work on this XYZ XYZ XYZ. I hope you got my point here, right,
Yeah,
guys?
yeah, of course. Andrea, did you want to go, or I'm happy to help as well?
Yeah, I mean, I have some thoughts, but feel free to lead.
So the first thing I say, politely as a friend is if the content generation efforts you have in giving away content or building a network were working really well, then you wouldn't have to sell. So one example is I never have to do prospecting anymore because people book time on my calendar. I have maybe 14,000 people who read my sales updates on email. And so don't devalue the importance of building that pipeline of people who get information about events and event hosting best practices and all this. What we're doing now, there's a lot of content that isn't written that you could build as a company. If it comes to hardcore selling, you need to have a very tight command of what are the pain points people go through when they're using platforms. I assume you compete with this platform and people like Zoom. you need to have 3 to 5 pain points that you feel most of your stakeholders have. And if you want to book a meeting more promptly, then what you write has to tie to that. It can't talk about your product in general, right? The third point is that people are used to getting things for free. They're used to free trials. They're used to getting given things. And maybe in different cultures and countries, it's different. In Australia, it's very different to how it is in the States. But if you're selling into the States, people don't want to be sold to in that first time. It's very difficult to do it right now. Those are my points for you.
Yeah. I would also add, I mean, looking to DW's point, once you establish yourself as an expert in the space and establish your niche, and that is through some of these sort of creative marketing practices, people do come to you. And the other thing I would say is, if you are resorting to sort of these cold calls, and I'm speaking from the perspective of someone in the States, but it's something we talked about in the main panel, which is asking questions and allowing it to be a conversation. And I think even the way that you're talking about it, right? These like hard sales, that's a mentality, right? That you need to come in hard, that it's hardcore sales. And I think for at least the sort of perspective of a lot of people in the States, and again, it may not carry over if you're somewhere else, we're very suspicious of being sold really hard out of the gate, and it doesn't allow us space to be a part of the conversation, and it doesn't allow you space to ask questions about what I, as the buyer, might need. And so I think in those initial outreach, less is more. Open the dialogue, but if you come in hard with like, this is what I can offer, this is what it is, people are gonna feel like the used car salesman is coming at them and will shut down. So I would say, as tempting as it is to come in hard, allow it to just be a first step in many, and to be a conversation. And DW, feel free to correct me if you feel that's not accurate.
No, I agree, but it's difficult. I understand the frustration. You want to book meetings, you want to get results, but you don't just want to do a long-term strategy that produces no results. In our company, I always call or make emails or connection requests because I've seen a reason why they don't. They're not performing. And for instance, I booked a meeting with Intercom, a very large provider of online chat, because they tried to upsell us, and the process was very disjointed and didn't have a lot of electronic components. So I just basically sent messages addressing the problems that I saw, rather than generic messages about, hey, did you know you could send documents with video and live chat? That's talking about me, but if I can talk about their problems, then I have more of a chance booking a meeting directly than a long-term approach. But yeah, I think you're on the right track. If you're on these meetings and trying to learn and improve, that's better than 99% of people out there. So you should feel proud of yourself for that.
I think too, you bring up a good point. I think you just briefly glossed over it, but so important, I think, for companies is having a handle on the actual data surrounding their outreach. I think sometimes we will invest so much in, Facebook marketing or certain types of sales outreach and not have the data to really understand what's leading to deals. In a former life, before I became a researcher, I worked in marketing and public relations, and we'd spend all this time on email marketing. And while we'd get a lot of clicks, when we looked at the transition to sales, it was very low. And so I think that understanding where you're seeing drop-offs in the pipeline is so important. So even for small businesses or people that feel like they don't have the resources out of the gate to track that stuff, like really, I recommend you do what you can to invest in that, because your resources are going to be limited. And so understanding how to best appropriate those resources is going to be critical to your survival.
Well, thank you for your question, and it was great. If others want to jump on too, we have a little bit more time left, don't we?
We do. I think we go till, till the hour mark.
Oh
Maybe?
yeah. So that's another 9 minutes. Oh no, 25. Yeah.
45. Okay, so 10 more minutes about.
Okay.
But yeah, other people have experiences negotiation that they want to talk about. We would love to hear it. If you're shy, feel free to put it in the chat.
I like the salary negotiation part. It's in your last role, so in an academic role, does that happen, or is it more? It seems like they'd be didactic on salary at Stanford.
Well, so yes and no. You know, in the early stages of your academic career, stuff like when you're a PhD student and you're working off fellowships or a postdoc, you don't have a lot of negotiating power, especially since many universities have very limited budgets. So it may seem like, oh, there's nothing to negotiate, right? And I think that goes back to thinking about other things that you can negotiate if they can't move on salary, because maybe they can't give you more of a base salary, but maybe they can give you more research funding and they have more discretion there. Maybe they can agree to fund more conference travel, or lighten your teaching load so you can focus more of your efforts on research. Like, these are all the different levers that in academia you can pull. So even while on the surface it may seem really rigid, I think there's actually more flexibility than people realize. And I think that's true in any negotiation is, you know, whether it's sales, whether it's negotiating something else, like, it's actually a very creative endeavor. And I think the more we can think about it that way, the better we will do, because yeah, it does require you to hold all these pieces in your brain and think about these creative combinations. For sure.
I find negotiating my own pay and salary very difficult, because in Australian culture we struggle to ask for things. There's also a bias against being better than others. So when you describe your achievements or you try to stand out, in America, that's okay. There's a lot of high flying, business experts and pros and things, and people idolize Hollywood and fame and riches. Here we call it tall poppy syndrome, where we try and cut everyone to equal size. And I found that for me, what's worked a lot better recently is to set up some KPIs or some criteria for my achievement in a year ahead of time. And I do this for the employees too. That way they don't have to negotiate at the end of the year, that they have, if they hit their milestones and goals, then they unlock what they wanted at the start of the year. The downside is that in 12 months, things can change, like have happened recently. And, although we've avoided a lot of the stress of having to have tough negotiations, maybe what they've inherited isn't good enough. So those are some things from a salary perspective that are interesting thoughts. Bias and negotiation came up in the comments as well. I was interested more to hear. I loved your research about gender bias. Are there other interesting statistics or studies that can help us improve that, or actually use it to our advantage in terms of, are there strengths of certain genders in different elements of negotiation?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, sometimes I'm torn when I talk about research on gender negotiation, because I don't want particularly women to feel disheartened about the state of the bias that exists. I think one thing I do want to highlight, especially when women feel like they shouldn't ask, is there was a study that was done where they asked managers to allocate basically an end of year bonus to employees. And they said that in one condition, people can't negotiate, you just decide, you can distribute the money how you want. And pretty much, the heartening news is that managers allocated it fairly based on performance to men and women. There wasn't any evidence of bias. But when the managers were told that, okay, well, after you allocate this bonus, then your employees can come back and basically negotiate with you. Yeah. What they found happened was the managers allocated much more to the men. And part of the reason that happens is that there's this assumption that, well, if men don't, men will be more willing to negotiate. So I can get away with giving a woman less. And the reason I highlight that is because sometimes we don't even realize that we're starting out being offered less because we just don't have that transparency, right? And that's what makes asking, whether you're a man or a woman, so important, because you don't know what hasn't been offered to you. And you may be starting off actually behind the starting line without even realizing it. But I think part of it too is understanding our own biases, right? And these biases to potentially treat women differently in a negotiation, like that emerges amongst both genders. Like, it's not just men penalizing women for negotiating aggressively. Like, we as women also hold beliefs about what is appropriate behavior. And so I think it's really important as well when we talk about these issues, not to make like one side the perpetrator of bias, that we all have a role in helping combat it. And I think there's other things too that you highlighted that are really important, which isn't necessarily about bias per se, but about cultural differences in especially as more and more companies become global. I think some of the greatest early case studies on cross-cultural negotiation were US-Chinese corporate mergers, and the ways in which those have fallen apart because the understanding of how to approach a deal was so different. And being open to what your counterpart thinks is acceptable behavior is going to be really important moving forward.
Yeah, it's crazy too, the use of, we talked about gestures on the panel. We also, language is another one, without naming names. Like, there was something said on the panel that if someone used that word with me, I just wouldn't buy from them. I feel like, there's a certain vernacular command of English that I expect in order to convey respect between people. And so it's interesting, a lot of people may struggle to understand why they couldn't sell that deal in New Zealand or that deal in Canada, but there are things to. French Canada is a huge one for North America. It's much different to sell there than selling into LA, for instance, right?
I can imagine.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I have a few stories running back of my time in Japan, working there. And but that was in Japanese, so I have Japanese DW, and then my Aussie self. I think it's fun to sometimes you need to think about creating a different name inside your own head, and that can help you remember to stop doing some of the cultural things that you would normally do in those settings. So
I think you said this on the panel though, which is it's so important to stay humble when negotiate. And I think that is so key with cross-cultural negotiation, is understanding like your way may not work, and staying humble in that. It looks like we're being told that we need to head back. DW, do you have any last thoughts you want to share to our remaining viewers?
No, I'm so honored to have such a wonderful panelist, and remember that my number one thing is no negotiation is the best thing. So if you're able to just take that good deal and be happy with that, come to the table with a number. But it was great to speak together.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, and thanks to everybody who chimed in or just was listening, and we will see you guys back on the main panel for our wrap-up, so don't forget to